Most people's pandemic hobbies were something relatively normal. My sister really got into knitting. Here she is with this big egg yolk she knitted and hung on her wall. She's very proud. My roommate really got into making fancy espresso. I know a lot of people who started painting, baking, doing yoga, or even making origami cranes. What I've realized is that we will do anything to pass the time that fulfills our sense of passion. Well, what fulfilled my sense of passion was getting really obsessed with the way that my computer's keyboard felt, to the point where I was spending hundreds of dollars to build custom, luxury, mechanical keyboards. Me and my wallet both wish I was kidding. This is a keyboard used by Tfue, a popular Twitch streamer. It boasts custom, anodized, aluminum key pulse casing with gasket mounting. It's got lubricated novel keys cream switches, the GMK Striker keycap set, and it was put together by the one and only Teha Types. Okay, I know those words mean literally nothing to any of you, but this keyboard is worth 3 times the monthly income of somebody working at the federal minimum wage. This guy spent $3,500 for a keyboard that doesn't even have all the keys. To an outsider to this hobby culture, this is outrageous. But to an insider, this is outrageous. Please make better financial decisions. The only difference is that as someone who knows the hobby, I can kind of appreciate the nuanced aspects of a finest quality keyboard like this one. And as much as I would love to just stand here and play 15 minutes of keyboard typing ASMR, I have a feeling that not everybody would be super into it. But the same goes for all of us in our own niche worlds. I'm sure if I asked you to tell me about your pandemic hobby, you could talk my ear off with websites, images, and unnecessarily detailed descriptions of the weird things you spend your money on. But there has undoubtedly been a renaissance and renewal of hobby culture over the last few years, fueled entirely by the COVID lockdowns. And as we have seen, we've had a lot more time to figure out what we actually enjoy doing. And this has posed a few key questions. How do we spend our time when it's all spent alone? How have we sculpted innovation, both on a personal level and on the global scale, thanks to this pandemic? And given this impending return to normalcy, is it important that we remain focused on what once brought us purpose? So, let's ponder pandemic pastimes and see exactly what implications a newfound love for personal interests may have for our future. So on to that first question. How do we spend our time when it's all spent alone? Well, the first thing that I did was try to deal with the impending mental dread of being locked in my room for weeks on end. So after ensuring that I had enough toilet paper to survive, which was a much larger task than anticipated, I settled into my entertainment space, and that's where my mechanical keyboarding hobby started. See, when you spend every single day with one item, you really appreciate the nuances of that item. And I wanted to love this thing that I typed on every day, so I became really obsessed with the mechanical feeling of typing. I loved the bump with every key press. I loved the thocky noises every time that I would type. I loved the potential cute design possibilities of the keycaps. It was all just so enticing. So I found my online communities, opened my wallet to the dismay of my high school savings, and I started spending. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is that when we are locked alone, we often develop hobbies that have to do with things that we already do or use. For me, it was keyboards, but I know a lot of people who got into pandemic baking, for instance. In fact, so many people started baking at the start of the pandemic that the United States actually ran out of flour in March of 2020. Other people really got into video games, specifically this one Animal Crossing, which came out right at the start of lockdown. It's this adorable children's game where you catch bugs to pay off your crippling mortgage. So, maybe not just for kids. But we spent our time trying to deal with the mental anguish of isolation. And this active leisure was great for our mental health. It sprinkled in some happy brain chemicals amidst the crippling, oh my God, society is collapsing chemicals. But we have seen that this has been a wonderful turn for our mental health. That's not some revolutionary conclusion, right? But what is revolutionary is the way that the pandemic specifically enabled that to happen. Because when we are locked alone, online communities become hubs for social interaction. Platforms like Pinterest, which are used for sharing everything from recipes to pictures of possums and funny hats, reported a 60% increase in traffic over the pandemic. Reddit exploded too. Hobby subreddits like r/mechanical keyboards, which have existed since 2012, sat at around 500,000 subscribers at the start of the pandemic, and now have over doubled in size. What we are seeing is that these online communities are incredibly effective hubs for our social interaction when we're isolated. And we can actually point to the specific elements of these communities that make them so enticing. Now, disclaimer, there is way more research on what makes a good cult than there is what makes a good hobby community. I guarantee you there's a scary amount of overlap. Take Teha Types, for example. Teha is one of the most popular Twitch streamers associated with the keyboarding community. He's an incredibly kind and gentle host, and he'll often curate very long streams where he will build keyboards from scratch, complete with some lazy cats in the background, some nice pastel colors, and even some smooth jazz to top it all off. But these streams are wonderful. It's just something you can leave on as you go about your day. He's a very effective content creator that keeps people coming back for more and keeps them involved in the community. Beyond that, the nomenclature used in these spaces is very interesting as well. So, quick rundown. There are these things called switches, which are the actual mechanical thing you press on a keyboard. There are a couple different styles, like tactiles, which have a little bump in the middle, or linears, which are smooth all the way through, or clickies, which nobody likes. But they have a bunch of different names that are fascinating, to say the least. They come in varieties like pandas, alpacas, blueberries, or creams. So basically, if it sounds like a stuffed animal or an ice cream flavor, it's a great name for a switch. So we have charismatic community figureheads, we have cozy language with words like panda and smooth jazz to establish the perfect aesthetic, and we have this indoctrination process of building your first keyboard. So, cult? Who's to say? But luxury keyboarding is just one way that we have sculpted innovation across the pandemic. And before we continue, I do think it's imperative that we define what innovation means, because innovation isn't just spending lots of money on keyboards or getting really into Animal Crossing. Innovation, put simply, is what happens when you learn something new and then put it into practice. So any new skill you learned over quarantine, like how to make really good, fancy espresso, once you start doing that, boom, you're innovating. One of the neatest innovative developments over quarantine has been this huge trend of do-it-yourself clothing. The COO of Depop, an online clothing retail store, remarked that DIY clothing has taken off in massive amounts, thanks to platforms like TikTok and YouTube, which offer ample tutorials on how to get started. There are a few different routes into the hobby, like going thrifting and sewing your own pieces. Or there's the easier route that is easily the most popular, and that is tie-dye. See, TikTok has done a great job of sharing tie-dye tutorials, where the hashtag tie-dye has been viewed over 1 billion times by this point, and people are really getting into it. What we are seeing is practical innovation spurred on by online communities that gave people a hobby that had to do with something they already owned. See, I'm not the only one. I'm not crazy here for liking mechanical keyboards. But it goes beyond just tie-dye too. Even knitting and crocheting has taken off. Like, check out these cool sweaters my sister knitted over summer of 2020. The one with the yellow sleeve is mine. Now is when I should probably admit that this entire TED Talk is just me showing off my sister's knitting portfolio. She doesn't have an Etsy store yet, but I'll be sure she gets one. But I asked her to show me some of her online communities to see if my hypothesis held up. And it did. Check out Ravelry, which also utilizes really cute animals with pastel coloring in their branding to entice you in. It's an online community that teaches you how to knit and crochet in different varieties with all these new skills. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. We find our passion, we find our online community, and we innovate. And this shift is representative of a renewed agency for us to express our personalities through our pastimes, rather than relying on corporations to produce something pre-made that suits our styles. Especially when we realized we could start selling these things online. Platforms like Depop, Mercari, and Etsy saw massive growth because people were turning their hobbies into jobs. So even though, at its core, the hobby renaissance was spurred on by a break from the capitalist cycle, some people still found a way to turn it into a job. So let's ponder post-pandemic pastimes. Perhaps personal passions precede personal peace. Given this impending return to normalcy, is it important for our mental health that we remain focused on what brought us purpose? Short answer, yes. Long answer, that's literally why I'm giving a TED Talk. I have barely touched mechanical keyboarding in over a year. For many, our pandemic pastimes are representative of a time that was filled with stress, isolation, and all the burdens of lockdown. Some clinical psychologists have reported a general increase in social anxiety in the years following this post-pandemic world, likely caused by the intense lack and fear of social interaction. And so what was once a way to find purpose in a pandemic is now just a remnant of a different time. And for many people, doing their hobbies isn't even feasible anymore. Now that we have re-entered this 40-hour work week cycle combined with home, school, and a social life, many people have dropped out of their hobbies, either out of necessity or disinterest. And I get it. I've barely spent any money on keyboard parts lately. I maybe will watch a Teja video or two, but for the most part, I've stopped that hobby altogether. So what we are seeing instead is a shift away. It is entirely possible that we are curating our lives to remove the need for these old passions. But is that regrettable? Do we need these passions to be at peace with ourselves? This is a very complicated question to answer because the United States has a very unique relationship to hobby culture. See, in the United States, there's this old adage. It goes along the lines of people in the US live so that they can work, while people in the rest of the world tend to work so that they can live. Because the United States has such a pro-work cultural drive, when we enter periods of less work, like a pandemic, we subconsciously seek something out to fill that gap. So, when relating that principle to whether it is imperative to have passions to be fulfilled, if your name is Karl Marx, the answer is probably a hard no. But for the rest of us, it's a nuanced yes. Don't let yourself be bogged down by considering what society thinks is a worthwhile way to find passion. Because we can find fulfillment in work. We can find fulfillment in hobbies. And that's okay. We find fulfillment in everything we do. We have sculpted innovation in times of incredible social duress. And looking back, we have seen when we are locked all alone, we often find or develop hobbies that have to do with the things we already do or use. And then we innovate on those hobbies with personal passion projects that promote our creativity. And finally, it's up to you whether you think it's actually worthwhile to bring your pandemic pastime into the future. Because having a hobby in the first place is a personal choice. So don't let someone tell you exactly how you find your passion. Just do what's right. And you know what really feels right? My keyboards, dude. I've been hyping these up all speech. Come find me afterward. I have one of my keyboards with me and a couple different switches you can try out. Just please wash your hands. And maybe you can tell me about your hobby. I'm all ears.